Welcome everybody. The question of terrorism is often looked at from the perspective of either politics or security. Seldom it is looked at it from sociological perspective. And to take us on this very stimulating and I would say challenging journey, we have with us Professor Riaz Hassan, who has not only been, Fulbright means the brightest scholars. He has been on a Fulbright, but taught at various international universities, including in US and in Singapore and in Australia, and done about 5 books or 4 books related to Islam. He's looking at suicide terrorism in South Asia. And as I think everybody would agree, that this is a region which is very, very important, very critical from the point of view of the kind of sufferings which have been inflicted by terrorism in general and suicide terrorism in particular. I shall not stand much between you and him. May I request him to kindly take us to this path of knowledge and understanding?
Thank you very much, Professor Nudi. I think I probably should say, I can't put it in my pocket. After 45 years of teaching, I'm programmed to talk for 60 minutes. Under rare circumstances, I can come down to 45 minutes. But when I looked at the program, I'm given only 30 minutes to talk. So I have to cut short some of the profound things that I was going to share with you. Now, I will still hopefully cover. But what I was going to say is that if at the end of it, you still have questions, you have 2 options. Either go and buy the books and read them, or you can come by and have a chat with me. I'd be delighted to see you. Now, very important, there are 4 sections to my presentation today. And these 4 sections, the nature of the phenomenon and its historical roots. Then I'd like to briefly talk about the global trends, and then share with you some of the paradigms which have been used to explain suicide terrorism, and then share with you the findings of my 5-6 years labors on trying to understand the suicide terrorism. I'm a fairly mainstream, some people call boring sociologist. So I'm not really I'm not a security specialist. I'm not an international specialist. I'm not an intelligence person. So what I'm going to share with you is really an extension of my research interest over a lifetime in 2 areas. The first one is, why do people suicide? So this particular research is an extension of the research that I have been doing for 40-some years on trying to understand suicide in human societies. And my second interest is death and dying. You see, death is the physical end of the body. And nature has absolutely a moral position. Nature doesn't care. Death occurs every day, every second of life, this end of life. But human beings have very complex attitude towards death. They range from adoration, admiration, celebration, to repulsion and anger, sadness. And what I like you to do is to remember, just like you to reflect on the fact what kind of attitudes you have about suicide bombers and suicide bombers as a phenomenon. If at the end of this talk you have not changed your opinion, then I think probably, I must admit, I probably would have to say I have to go and start doing the research again. But in any case, the very important part of this research is trying to share with that why human beings in human societies we have such complex range of emotions about suicide, about death and dying. Suicide bombing is emblematic of a modern wave of global terrorism. And I wanted to make a point that this is not the only wave of terrorism. There have been 3 other waves of terrorism in the last 150 years or so, and you can see them listed here on the slides. I don't have time, but otherwise I would have been happy to share some of these waves and the kind of weapons which were used in each one of these waves. Now, having said that my interest in this topic is an extension of my research, the point is why do humans suicide? There is a very simple way to conceptualize this problem. If you ask the question, is suicide a disease? Then you are medicalizing it. And if you ask yourself, suicide is a kind of malaise, which is caused by cultural, social, economic, and whole range of associated factors, then you are thinking in a sociological sense. In sociology and psychiatry, suicide has been viewed as an end in itself, as an end, as an exit from an intolerable existential pain. My research over many years have tried to emphasize, both in Singapore, and the book in Singapore was called The Way of Dying, and the book in Australia was called Suicide Explained. It's been basically trying to argue that that suicide is not an end, but also is not an end, but means to multiple ends. So it's not an end in the sense that it's an exit from existential pain, but actually it is means to achieve multiple ends. And it could be self-empowerment in the face of powerlessness, it could be redemption in the face of damnation, and it could be honor in the face of humiliation. Now, use of life as a weapon is not new. It has historical roots. And in my work, I explore some of the main historical roots. I just wanted to mention to you, because of the time constraints, and these 5 examples that I use, that historically, a whole range of personalities, from Cato, the Roman general in Utica, to Jesus Christ, to the Jewish sect of Zealot and Sicari, and the Order of Assassins, and the Japanese kamikaze pilots, have used life in order to advance ideals which were broader than their life, the ideals which actually were trying to convey to people the ideals and the values that their societies and they themselves valued more than their life itself. Unfortunately, if I went into the cases of any of these examples in detail, it probably take too much time. But let me just give you a very brief example of Roman General Cato. In the second half of the 1st century BC, Caesar had basically was on his way to become the emperor. And there was enormous resentment in Roman Empire against that movement. Cato was defeated, and before Caesar was going to see him the following day, and the night before Caesar was to see him, he committed suicide. And Caesar is supposed to have come and said to him, I resent your death because you have not allowed me to forgive you, because that's what Caesar was going to do. And within 2 years of Cato's death, Cato's followers had organized themselves and assassinated Caesar. So Caesar was able to achieve through his life, to his suicide, things that he could not achieve in his life. And by the way, he has been immortalized in some of the classical works in literature, and you can see some of them. Perhaps the thing that you probably would be more familiar with are the Japanese tradition of political and military sacrifice. Kamikaze suicide missions operated for 10 months only towards the end of the Japanese knew that they were going to be defeated. They started from about 25th of October 1944 until Japan surrendered on the 15th of August 1955. And 3,843 missions were carried out. And in April 95, the Battle of Okinawa remains one of the most costly battles in the American naval history. But the point was that these pilots were not uneducated, were highly educated, and they knew what they were doing, and they were doing it for a cause which was much broader than the life that they were going to sacrifice themselves. Now, the point of the reason I'm belaboring this point is that it highlights that suicide, because suicide is an integral part of suicide bombing, that under certain circumstances, the act of suicide is means to achieving multiple ends. And it shows to the witnesses that they have, the people who are carrying out these acts have values which are much broader. They value not their life, but the values of the broader community for which they are prepared to sacrifice themselves. Now let me move on to the global trends, which I'd like to share with you. Between 1981 and 2011, there were 2,297 suicide bombing attacks, killed close to 30,000 people and injured 10 times more in 36 countries. Roughly, suicide bombing constitute about 4% of all terrorist attacks, but they account for about 32% of all terrorism-related deaths. So you can see right away why terrorist organizations use suicide as a weapon, because it is lethal and it's more effective and it has far more casualty rate. This is the distribution of suicide bombing in the period that I'm talking, 1981 to 2011. Now you can see the distribution of suicides. So Iraq was the main site between 2003 and 2009, and it's still suicide bombing is going on. But the height of suicide bombing in Iraq was 2006 and 2007, 2005, 2006. In fact, the spike occurred after the publication of Abu Ghraib photographs. Suicide bombing rates actually skyrocketed in Iraq. Since then, interestingly, the suicide bombing actually has been moving gradually to South Asia. And this is and you can see from the distribution, mostly mostly Pakistan, Afghanistan first, Sri Lanka and Pakistan. And India has now I don't know whether you can see this graph, but you can see the number of suicide attacks in Iraq, 900 some, followed by Afghanistan, and this development has occurred only in the last few years. The first suicide bombing attack, first suicide attack in Afghanistan occurred in 2001, just before 9/11, when Massoud was killed by 2 Al-Qaeda operators. That was the first suicide bombing. So suicide bombing actually had not been known in the conflict. And just bear in mind that there was a violent conflict in Afghanistan between 79 to 89 against Soviet Union, but there was no suicide bombing during that period. So the first one occurs, which killed Masood in September 2001. And then it has skyrocketed. Pakistan is next, and Sri Lanka now, of course, has managed to resolve at least for the time being, the cause of suicide bombing, the conflict. But you can see if you combine these rates, can you hear? I think I probably keep using it. But this is by the regions. When I started research in 2004, the total number of suicide bombing in the world between 1981 and 2003 was 315. And I prepared my research proposal to submit to the Australian Research Council, thinking, well, there will be another 50 that I'd be looking at in 2004, and 2005 I'll start writing. Then came the Iraq invasion. Between 2003 and 2008, there were more suicide attacks in Iraq alone than there were in the preceding 25 years in the world. And now you can see the figures. You can see 942 attacks in Iraq alone. It's 972 in Iraq. 43% of all suicide attacks occurred in Iraq. And I want you to bear in mind, this is an important, this figure is important, and I'll come to it a bit later. South Asia is the next, 41%, 942. And all South Asian attacks occurred in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and 13 in India in this period. This is a slightly more detailed distribution of the same figures. You can see the global attacks, you can see the Iraq, and then you see the more sort of the Afghanistan 545, India 13, Pakistan 277, and Sri Lanka 107. And if you look at the last column, you can also see that the death per suicide attacks actually varies quite significantly across countries. I have done quite a detailed analysis why there are such varied outcomes of suicide attacks in different countries. Again, I won't have time, but just really quickly, it depends upon the training of people who are carrying out the suicide bombing. 42% of all suicide attacks in Afghanistan kill only one person, the suicide bomber, because it's simply not very well trained, whereas they're more lethal in Israel-Palestinian conflict, and they were also very lethal in the case of Sri Lanka, partly because, and in Pakistan too, because people are the suicide bombers have been well trained. The other factors which influence the outcome, it depends on how hard the main targets are. Secondly, how well the state security services, health services, and fire brigade, etc., are. Whereas I think the most efficient services for emergencies are in Israel. Therefore, Israel has probably lower suicide fertility rate than other countries, whereas they are the least developed in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And you can see that, and Afghanistan is basically the inefficiency. In Iraq, it was essentially the absence of services. I've already mentioned that suicide attacks constitute about 4% of all terrorist attacks, but they account for 33% of total deaths. A suicide attack is about 12 times more lethal than a non-suicide attack. I won't go into that, but in general, the targets they vary quite significantly along conflict sites. In Sri Lanka, the main targets were, in South Asian context, security forces, but in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, they tend to be much more sort of equally divided between civilians and security forces and others. And it's very difficult to get information, so I don't want to give you the impression that I have this absolute watertight statistical data. It is very difficult to get information about such details. Globally, 56% of all attacks are car bombs, and suicide vest, the suicide bombing attacks by individuals, 40%, and it is different in South Asia in the sense that in Sri Lanka they were roughly equally divided, whereas in the case of Pakistan and Afghanistan, the dominant type of suicide bombing is an individual carrying on a suicide attack. Now, here comes the main meat of the presentation. Then I started research. I did a thorough literature search. And basically, I classified the studies into three categories: the personal characteristic and motivation of the perpetrator. The second group of studies focused on the terrorist organization. And third, which not that many, on the societal condition. And this is where most of my work actually has been directed at. Now, when it came to personal characteristics, most of the studies, primarily coming from Israel and Palestine, and some from other places, basically looked at suicide bombing as a phenomena which was carried out by psychologically impaired, morally deficit, ignorant, uneducated people, and primarily who were also fanatical in their religious beliefs. So there was a very negative kind of, basically it was psychopathology, poverty, lack of education that was given the primary explanatory cause of suicide bombing in these studies. And the perception, negative perception, was primarily because suicide is a stigmatized death. In human societies, suicide is stigmatized death. And then you combine terrorism, which is a criminal act. So you combine the two, suicide and terrorism, you get a very negative stereotype. And so this negative stereotype was actually reflected in these studies. And basically, the public policies which followed this perception were killing or restraining or incarcerating the deranged individuals in order to remove them from society. It was basically kill them or imprison them, and then everything would be fine. The second set of variables, a second set of studies were basically which focused on terrorist organization. And these studies focused on, emphasized, conceptualized suicide bombing, or explained suicide bombing as a weapon of the weak in asymmetrical conflict between state and non-state actors, because it was comparatively lethal and 12 times more lethal than other form of suicide, other form of terrorism. It's mechanically simple and cheap. It costs anywhere between $1,000 to $10,000, depending on the type of attack. Sometimes it could be more because of the nature of the vehicle used. It's very versatile and tactical. It can reach very well-protected targets. And it mobilizes support from sympathetic constituencies. It sends a message to people that I'm prepared to sacrifice to this constituency, that I'm prepared to sacrifice my life. Why don't you do the same? And it also provides, it has benefits for the sponsoring organization. Coercing, basically, it has a very powerful coercive impact on the adversary. Suicide bombing, for example, generally, for example, if you take the Sri Lankan case, it started out with 8 or 9 group actually started. Eventually, the Tamil Tiger killed all of them or subdued all of them and became the main. So they usually try to, first thing they do is to basically try to destroy their opponents. And it also gives the advantage to the organization over rivals as a result of their success over the rivals. And the public policies which emerge, which are based on this kind of studies, of this perception, are the targeted killings of leaders and altruistic punishment, the COIN, the counterinsurgency operation. Now the problem with the targeted killing of leaders is this. Suicide bombing are carried out by organizations which are cellular. They are not bureaucratic. The difference between a bureaucratic organization and a cellular organization is that when the leader of bureaucratic organization is eliminated or dies, take for example, university, vice chancellor, something happens, you go and employ another vice chancellor, or the World Bank, or some other organization. But cellular organizations which operate as cells, if you kill the leader, then they don't go and recruit the other leader. They actually divide, the cell becomes basically, it disperses. And each member of the cells becomes a leader. And there's quite significant number of studies which show, done by Catherine Carmel at the university, in one of the US universities, the name will come back to me, basically sponsored by the US Navy and Air Force. Basically, cellular organization tend to multiply when you kill the leader, unlike the bureaucratic organization. So actually, by killing the cellular leader, you're actually making the problem more widespread. Now, the third set of studies were the basically oppressive occupation of homeland by powerful enemy, violation of cultural codes of honor and shame, humiliation, revenge, retaliation, altruistic sacrifice for honorable survival, etc. Now, these are all the list, and I'm going to come to it, so I won't read all of them. Now, I would now go to the main part of my research. I spent about 4 years making detailed studies of Iraq, Palestine, Israel, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And the reason why I did it, because these were the 5 countries where 90% of suicide attacks occurred. And these are the lessons. First, suicide, the genesis of suicide bombing. Suicide bombing just don't occur out of nowhere. In order for suicide bombings to occur, there are certain preconditions. And the preconditions are, the most fundamental precondition, an intractable conflict between state and non-state actors over dispossession, territorial occupation, and equality of citizenship. All case studies that I have go into details of the configuring the conflict before suicide bombing actually emerged as a weapon by the weapon in the conflict. So the first and foremost condition, or precondition for the rise of suicide bombing is an intractable, endemic political conflicts or political entitlement, territorial occupation, and dispossession. Second precondition is the state-sponsored violence or state-sanctioned violence against the non-state actors. No terrorist group anywhere in the world can stand up to the national armies. It's simply a myth, and I always am amazed when people keep on saying that terrorists are so powerful they can take on national army. You saw what happened in Sri Lanka. But state-sponsored violence or sanctioned violence against the weaker party, against the non-state actor, is the second precondition. Once that begins, then the terrorist organization begin to improvise weapons. The weapons, they say, the state doesn't have, but we do. And this is where suicide bombing and terrorism in general and suicide bombing in particular emerges. Invariably, this violence between state and non-state actors also involves large-scale population dislocation refugee camps. Refugee camps are basically the breeding grounds of suicide bombing. Incarceration of dissidents, dehumanization, the treatment of people in jails. Osama bin Laden's deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was a very distinguished doctor. He was arrested after the assassination of Anwar Sadat. And when he was jailed, he was brutally treated. He was brutalized, sodomized, brutally treated. And I know from sources who knew him that he said when he came out, he would never they basically saw the state as an enemy. And he then, the Egyptian jihad then became part of Al-Qaeda. And then, of course, psychological operations, which basically demonize the opposition. So the state plays a very critical role, and for legitimate reasons, in demonizing the insurgents, in provoking them to take actions which eventually lead to suicide bombing. Firstly, suicide bombers are not mad, and they're not bad, in the sense that I have done detailed analysis, and I have failed to find, other studies have failed to find a stable set of demographic, psychological, or socioeconomic variables that can be causally linked to suicide bombers' personalities or socioeconomic origin. Poverty, their personality-wise, they're not psychopathology, they're not psychopaths. They're fairly normal people. There are no apparent connection between the violent militant activity and personality disorders. The only one thing that correlates, that they tend to be young male. That is the only demographic variable that appears to show up, which is persistent or consistent. Becoming suicide bombing is a highly selective process. People say, you know, these are people who are psychopaths and they're mentally deranged. Even my friends in Pakistan still tell me that these people are. The problem is that if you actually see how suicide bombings are recruited and how they are trained, a psychopath, a psychologically impaired person would be a disaster for the terrorist organization, because if they are arrested, they will spill the bean, and they will not be able to carry out the missions. So the becoming suicide bomber is a highly selective process which acts as a screening device to exclude people who suffer from psychopathologies. Most suicide bombers are basically psychologically normal, deeply integrated into social networks, and emotionally attached to the national communities. It's a strategic weapon, a tactic, because it basically enables the deployment, is cost effective, and it is very effective in reaching the high value targets. And it's at a very high symbolic value, because it communicates to the supporters that we are prepared to sacrifice our life, and therefore it galvanizes both the opposition as well as support for the phenomenon. It serves the interest of sponsoring organization by coercing adversary to make concessions and by giving the organization advantage over the rival in terms of support from constituency. A friend of mine who did a lot of work on IRA in the UK told me when I was doing this research, he said when the IRA were carrying on their attacks in Northern Ireland, British government didn't care. As soon as they came to London, they said, let's sit down and talk. So you see, they were able to negotiate. And generally, the political scientists view that suicide bombing by terrorist organizations are effective against democracies. Because what they're trying to do, they are pressuring the public opinion to swing in favor of their demands, or at least pressure the government to make concessions to the terrorists. But they're not all that successful against the non-democratic regimes. They're driven mainly by politics, not religion. I've already pointed out how they emerge in endemic, intractable conflicts. So the use in political, the suicide bombing is used in political conflicts over political entitlements, dispossession, and territorial occupation. It's a weapon of last resort by sponsoring organizations after they have done everything else. And again, you can go and look at the configuration of the conflict. Palestinian, the Sri Lankan Tamils, they went through, it's not so much in Iraq or in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but in many instances, that's why you can't find a universal kind of solution or understanding of suicide bombing. You have to actually look at each conflict and try to actually isolate the main causes. But both in Palestine and in Sri Lanka, the terrorist organization which sponsored suicide bombing in the end actually had gone through a whole gamut of organized, they carried out strikes, they organized into political parties, they got elected into parliament of no avail. When everything failed, then they actually went into the open conflict. Religion plays some role, and there's no question about that religion plays a vital role in recruiting people, but it is not the primary motivation. In fact, my research showed that majority of the suicide attacks in the period I was able to, between 1981 to 2003, were actually carried out by secular socialist organizations. I again basically you can see the main argument is that participation in suicide mission has multiple purposes: gaining community approval, personal redemption, honor for survival of community. All these factors that you can see on the slide, they contribute to mobilization of suicide bombing. So all these factors relate to politics, not to religion. I have focused quite a bit on the role of humiliation. Humiliation is an intense personal and emotional experience arising from destruction of culturally grounded definition of self-worth and dignity. I think one of the very important lessons social scientists have learned is in order to destroy people, you don't have to physically kill them. You destroy the institution which sustain life. And the most extreme example would be the Native Americans and Australian Aboriginal people. You don't have to physically kill them. You just destroy the institution. You tell them the religion is bad, the culture is bad, the body smell, whole range of things that makes us get up every morning and get on with life. It's the institutions that we value, that sustain, that actually energize life. They are devalued. Once they are devalued, you subject people to humiliation, to slow death. And I think what happens in conflicts is the devaluation, wholesale devaluation of the very values which makes people what they are, which gives them the dignity and worth. The point of Abu Ghraib exercise was not to kill people, but to humiliate them, And this humiliation was essentially a mechanism of submission. And modern states use humiliation in a whole range of ways in order to seek submissiveness, and obedience from the citizen. And certainly in conflict, humiliation is used very effectively by the state in order to demonize the. I've been given a signal that I should hurry up. But basically, I would have to say you have to read the book. But humiliation actually aids the subculture of suicide bombing. It's driven by revenge and retaliation. Revenge is infliction of harm in return for perceived injury. Desire for revenge and willingness to carry out violence are tied to self-worth of the offended person, and to deter and act as a deterrent role against the future injustices. Basically, in human societies, revenge and retaliation, I could go on quite a bit on this, but revenge fulfills very important goals. than people who have been subjected to injustice. And retaliation is just part of it. It's an altruistically driven action. Altruistic, what do you mean by altruism? Altruistic are things that we do, costly things that we do which benefits others. And basically, altruism plays a very important role in motivating people to suicide bombing, as well as in galvanizing support for suicide bombing. Particularly so in communities which have undergone a very long, extended period of endemic conflict. Now, my final point is that when a threat to social order is made, the fundamental duty of the state is to ensure that protection of person, of life and property, and maintenance of social order. When there's a threat to life, to property, and to social order, state can legitimately inflict punishments. And this is what is known as the altruistic punishments. Now the problem is altruistic punishment, and this is what counterinsurgency operations are supposed to make terrorism more expensive, more costly to the sponsor of organization. But the problem is that in human societies, if the punishment exceeds the norm of fairness, then it becomes counterproductive. So when altruistic punishments inflicted, carried out by the state against the terrorist organization are seen to be unfair, then they actually become counterproductive. I'll just conclude by saying that really, in order to stop this heinous form of violence, I think we need to basically understand the very causes which have given rise to the conflict. Unless that conflict, we can resolve the conflict, it will be very difficult to find a resolution. Now, we would have to, the state, the actors involved would have to make concessions in some significant ways which satisfy the people, which actually satisfy the people who are involved in the conflict. And without those concessions, without some kind of compromises, it is almost impossible to really completely wipe out suicide terrorism. Well, I could go on, but let me stop here because I think I've already taxed the chairs and your patience. Thank you very much.